Before the creation of the world, did God know what I would do in various circumstances? The Molinist thinks the answer is yes. But the question is, how? How does God have that kind of knowledge? And if the Molinist says, well, he's omniscient, so end of story, that just doesn't quite seem satisfying. So fortunately, my guest tonight is, I almost said doctor, not doctor yet, but Justin Mooney. And Justin, thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for being here.
So, can you just briefly tell me how you got interested in the topic of Molinism?
Yeah, sure. So I first got interested in Molinism when I was in college. So it was when I was in college that I first kind of became aware of the theological debates about foreknowledge and divine providence. And I started to think a lot about those because I took that issue to be a potential threat to the coherence of my religious beliefs. I wanted to know, is there like a coherent story to tell about how, divine providence and human freedom and things like that fit together? And in the course of, looking into those things, somebody said, well, have you heard of Molinism? And I hadn't. So I started to look into Molinism. And I actually had an almost immediate objection when I discovered the view. And that objection is the one that we're talking about tonight. So it has stuck with me for a long time. But I also was very sympathetic to Molinism kind of from the beginning, and I've continued to be very sympathetic to it. There are times when I would have said, yeah, I'm a Molinist. There are also times when I would say, I'm not really sure. I'm undecided between a bunch of different views, but I've consistently been very sympathetic to the view. And I think that one of the main reasons for that is that it has a great deal of explanatory power. I think it solves a lot of puzzles in theology. And I think we're often justified in believing theories that have a lot of explanatory power, even when not all the kinks have been worked out. So anyway, there's some thoughts.
Perfect. I will mention that SlamRN said your hippo looks wounded. She says she just can't really see it, and she's worried. So,
yeah, this is my hippo Homer. He's made of cardboard, but yeah, he's a little bit hard to see this time.
For those that are just getting to know Justin, he is a huge fan of hippopotamuses. Hippopotami? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's what's usually said.
Okay, hippopotami. All right, well, so we've mentioned the word a couple of times. What is Molinism?
Yeah, so this is an important question. So the basic idea is this. Molinism is a theory about how God controls the world. And it was invented by a guy named Luis de Molina, who is a Spanish Jesuit in the 1500s. And the selling point of this theory is supposed to be that it gives you an account of how God can have sort of detailed control over what happens in history, but in a way that's compatible with a pretty robust notion of free will. The kind of free will where we can perform actions that are not causally determined either by God or by prior circumstances or by anything else. Okay, so that's like the very, very basic idea. But I think of Molinism as having kind of two main parts to it. So one part of Molinism is about certain propositions that are usually called counterfactuals of freedom. So a counterfactual of freedom is a proposition about what an agent would freely choose in certain circumstances. So one counterfactual of freedom says that if I were in circumstances where it was feasible for me to own a pet hippopotamus, I would freely choose to own a pet hippopotamus. That's one counterfactual of freedom. And the kind of freedom that's involved in these counterfactuals is what's sometimes called libertarian freedom. So it's supposed to be the kind of free will where your action is not causally determined. And that means that the circumstances that are described in a counterfactual freedom don't determine the choice that is described by that counterfactual. So it's not like, well, if I were in circumstances where it was feasible for me to buy a hippo, in those circumstances, that would determine that I buy a hippo. No, it's just that, in fact, I would, even though the circumstances don't necessitate it. Okay, so that's counterfactual of freedom is, and there are plenty of other examples. A theological example that's often used would be like, well, if Peter were in certain circumstances, Peter would freely deny Christ. Now, what the Molinist says about counterfactuals of freedom is that some of them are true, and more specifically, that some of them are true explanatorily prior to God creating the world. What does that mean? Well, let's make a simplifying assumption. So let's assume that God is not timeless and that God existed literally before creating the world. That's a controversial assumption, but it's not really a part of Molinism. It's just going to make it easier to talk about Molinism. So just for the sake of simplicity, suppose that God existed literally before creating the world. The Molinist thinks not only that some counterfactuals of freedom are true, but that they were true even before God created anything. So even before God created anything, it was already true that if I were in circumstances where it was feasible to own a pet hippopotamus, I would freely choose to own a pet hippopotamus. Okay, so that's what the Molinist says about counterfactuals of freedom. Was that reasonably clear so far?
Yes, I was able to follow.
Cool. So here's the other part of Molinism. The other part of Molinism is about God. And what the Molinist says is that God has middle knowledge. Now, there's a story about why middle knowledge is called middle knowledge, but I think we can actually just bypass that and not go into that kind of complication. So here's what middle knowledge is. It's roughly just knowledge of counterfactuals of freedom. So the Molinist idea is not simply that it's true that I would, buy or own a pet hippo if I were in appropriate circumstances, but that God also knows that that's true. And then more specifically, the Molinist wants to claim that God's knowledge of those counterfactuals is infallible. So it's not just that God is like, really good at making guesses about what people would do in various circumstances. Rather, God cannot be wrong about what people would freely do in various circumstances. And then finally, the Molinist adds that God has this knowledge, again, even before creating the world. So even before God created anything, God already knew that if God decided to create me and put me in circumstances where it was feasible to have a pet hippo, I would choose to have a pet hippo. And then I think maybe the only other thing I might add in terms of just characterizing what Molinism is that Molinists think that God uses God's middle knowledge to sort of ordain what's going to happen in history. So, by knowing like, okay, if this person were in these circumstances, they would do this and so forth, God can kind of plan out everything that's going to happen in the history of the world.
Very good. So just to summarize what you're saying there, Molinism, the view, has two components. And the first is what we call counterfactual of freedom. And you can break those terms down as counterfactual being something that doesn't actually happen. It was either it's something that is possible or could have happened. I guess actually we should say it would happen, right?
Yeah. So it's a fact about what would have been the case if certain non-actual circumstances had been actual.
Very good. Okay, the would there is very important. And then the second component of Molinism is the middle knowledge part. And so the main idea there is God knows which of these counterfactuals are true, and he can't be wrong about that. It's not a good guess. He knows with certainty which ones are true prior to the creation of the world.
Right, yeah. The only thing I would add to that, just for the sake of clarification, is so the Molinist main commitment about the counterfactuals is not just that there are those counterfactuals, because even at least some non-Molinists will be happy to grant that. It's more specifically that some of them are true even before God creates anything. That's really like the contentious part of the Molinists' claim about counterfactuals.
Very good. All right, so there are plenty of objections to Molinism, but the paper that we're referring to, you only address one of the objections, and this is the one you mentioned at the beginning that bothered you as soon as you heard about Molinism. So, by the way, those viewers that are interested in going deeper, the paper that we are summarizing in this discussion is linked in the description of the video. It's called How God Knows Counterfactuals of Freedom, and it's published in the journal Faith and Philosophy. So go check it out if you'd like more details by the end. All right, so just go ahead and summarize this objection for me.
Yeah, okay, so this objection is one that Molinists have not really talked much about, at least not like contemporary Molinists. I know of 5 authors who have pressed this objection in print, but I can think of like only Molinists who have even said anything about it besides me. And the objection is this. The thought is like, all right, suppose that there really are these counterfactuals of freedom that are true before God creates anything. All right, now that all by itself is very controversial, but this objection says, okay, suppose we grant that, suppose that's true. Then the worry is, well, how could God possibly know them in the way that the Molinist thinks that God does? Meaning, like, how could God know them infallibly and before creating anything? And to give you kind of the feel of the worry, let me knock down a couple of thoughts that might be like initially tempting for like how to answer this question, right? So one thought that some people might find tempting is, well, can't God just, by knowing all the details about these, hypothetical or merely possible circumstances and, the agent's psychological states in those circumstances, can't God use that information to predict like how the person would choose in that situation? And that's a tempting thought, I think, initially, but it ultimately isn't going to work. And that's because remember that in a counterfactual of freedom, the circumstances in the counterfactual, which will include the agent's like psychological states and so forth, do not determine how the agent would choose. And so the best that information could do for God would be to give God, information that would enable God to like make a guess, and maybe a very good guess about what we're going to do. But it wouldn't give God infallible knowledge of what we're going to do. It wouldn't be impossible for God to turn out to be wrong on that, if that were the basis for God's middle knowledge. Another thought that might, seem tempting at first is you might think, well, God knows the future. Can't God just sort of like look into the future and see like what I would choose if I were in circumstances where it was feasible for me to have a pet hippopotamus? And then, God could know in that way what I would choose. And the problem with that approach is that a lot of these choices are never going to happen. So I may never be in circumstances where it's feasible for me to have a pet hippopotamus. And in that case, that situation and that choice are not in the future for God to sort of look ahead and see what's going to happen. And so that story isn't going to work either. Okay, so you can hopefully begin to see, kind of like the flavor of the problem. It's like, all right, the Molinist says that God knows certain facts infallibly before creating, but it's not immediately obvious how God could possibly come by that knowledge. And then, there are various people in the literature who have tried to take this worry that's sort of fuzzy the way I've presented it and sharpen it into an argument against Molinism. And I think a little bit later, after I've laid out my view, we'll talk a bit about how they've done that and where I think their arguments fail. But so I think for now, maybe do you think that's probably good enough?
Okay. So we've defined what Molinism is, these two components, and then you just laid out the objection. And now what I want to do is get into your response to the objection. And I've tried to create a slide with what you decided to call the 3 ingredients for middle knowledge. And this will explain how Molinism works, or how God has middle knowledge. So I've just put this slide on the screen. Why don't you, you can do it however you want. You can mention all three at first and then unpack them, or do it one at a time, however you like.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll take them one at a time. So let me start with just the basic kind of core thought of my proposal. So what I try to do in this paper is I try to answer the objection that there's no way for God to know true counterfactuals of freedom by proposing what I take to be a feasible account of how God could know them, to give what in the paper I actually call a mechanics of middle knowledge, story about how it is that God figures out, so to speak, which counterfactuals of freedom are true. And that story does have like these three ingredients to it. But the basic idea to start with is just that God is directly acquainted with the fact that certain counterfactuals of freedom instantiate the property of being true. Okay, now by itself, that isn't particularly illuminating. So let me flesh that out a bit. Okay, so the first ingredient in my proposal is this theory that was developed by William Alston several decades ago in a paper called Does God Have Beliefs?, which I think is an excellent paper. And in this paper, Alston, among other things, argues that God's sort of mode of knowledge is one of sort of direct contact with the world. He argues that God is directly acquainted with every fact. And his thought here is that this is the most perfect, exalted, excellent mode of knowledge that any being could have. And so he thinks for that reason, it's the appropriate sort of knowledge to attribute to God. And the thinking here is like, well, direct acquaintance with a fact is, it's like the fact is like laid bare before the agent's mind, right? So there's no like mediating mechanism. It's not like God is relying on, eyeballs or inferences that God is making, reasoning through an argument to try to figure out that something is true. There's not even a representational state like a belief mediating between God and the facts that God is acquainted with on this view. It's this direct epistemic access to the world. And there's an analogy I use in the paper that I think is helpful for kind of appreciating what Alston is saying here. And the analogy, or at least one version of it, goes like this. So consider your relationship to your own thoughts. So, for example, maybe if you imagine like the color green in your head, right? There's a relationship that you stand in to that sort of like thought of greenness in your head. And that relation seems to be something like a direct acquaintance relation. You are directly acquainted in some way with your own occurrent thoughts. And if you want to make the case even more analogous to God's case, you can imagine an unembodied mind, like a Cartesian ego that's just contemplating its own thoughts. And it seems like that ego is sort of directly acquainted in some sense with its own occurrent thoughts. And the thought here is that, well, similarly, God is directly acquainted with every single fact in something like that way. Now, you might worry that, you might think, well, I can maybe be directly acquainted with like the thoughts in my own mind, but you might think I can't be related to like facts about the material world or facts about what's going on in other people's minds in the way that I'm directly acquainted with my own thoughts in my own mind. And I think that's probably right, but I take Alston's suggestion to be not that God is acquainted with every fact in exactly the same way that we're acquainted with our own thoughts, but rather that God stands in an acquaintance relation with every fact that's just sort of analogous to, in some ways like the relation that we stand into our own thoughts. But it's a kind of acquaintance relation that God could stand into any fact whatsoever, including facts about the physical world, facts about the mental world, facts about the abstract world, and so forth. And then again, you might also worry like, well, you might think I don't really have any good sense of like, what would it be like to be directly acquainted with a fact about like the material world or a fact about something in someone else's head or something like that. But I think that this too is not an especially worrisome problem, because if perhaps per impossible we were not directly acquainted with our own thoughts, I think we'd have a hard time conceiving of what it would even be like for us to be directly acquainted with our own thoughts. And so it's not surprising that maybe we have a hard time getting a grasp on like what it would be like for God to be directly acquainted with various facts, or what the intrinsic nature of that acquaintance relation would come to. Okay, so that's the first ingredient in the story then, Alston's account of God's direct knowledge by direct acquaintance. The second ingredient, well, actually, maybe I should pause. Was that clear?
Yes, it was. So I like the analogy you make of this kind of unembodied mind just being directly acquainted with its own thoughts as it just reflects on, perhaps I'm imagining it's looking at an apple and it's thinking about its thought that it's looking at an apple or something like that. Is that fair?
Yep.
Okay. So that's what you are imagining when you talk about direct acquaintance or something like that. And
something.
So that's just the first ingredient, that God stands in that kind of relationship, not just with the kind of direct access to his own thoughts, but every fact.
Yep.
Okay.
Cool.
Now, before we move on to the second ingredient, Andrew Moon decided he's going to pick on you. He's already got some objections. I think it will clarify. So, and you're welcome to put your answer off until we go through all three ingredients. But he says, okay, the problem. So at the beginning we laid out what Molinism is, and then we said, oh well, this problem comes up, and he was saying, so is the problem just a question? And that is, how does God know these true counterfactuals? Is that all it is just a question, or is it an actual argument? Because he's wanting the actual steps of the argument for it to be a real objection.
Right. Yeah. So I think it starts out as a question, and then a number of authors have tried to take this question and sort of turn it into an argument against Molinism. And when I'm done explaining how my account works, I'll actually say something a little bit about like exactly how they formulate the arguments and where I think those arguments go wrong. But I didn't do that initially, mostly because we're just kind of following the flow of the paper. And actually, it was a referee who made me organize the paper this way.
Okay.
But
so there you go, Andrew. Stick that in your pipe and smoke it. All right, we're gonna go ahead and move to the second ingredient then.
Yeah.
And I've put that slide back on the screen, so you can tell me about the second ingredient.
Cool. Yeah. So the second ingredient in my proposal is an account of what facts are. So if on Alston's view of divine knowledge, God is directly acquainted with every fact, it's natural to ask, well, what's a fact? And there are different answers to that question. Different philosophers take different views on that. But the view that I take in this paper is one that's defended by David Armstrong. And on Armstrong's view, a fact, he actually calls them states of affairs. I'm calling them facts. But on Armstrong's view, facts are instantiations of properties by objects. So, for example, take the fact that hippos are fat. That fact, on this view, on Armstrong's view, consists in hippos instantiating the property of being fat. Okay, so Armstrong has a lot to say about this view, and he's defended it in several books. But here's one kind of fundamental bit of his thought about facts. So think about a truth like that hippos are fat, right? That's a truth. It's something that's true. What is it about the world, or what way would the world have to be in order for that truth to be true? And it seems like you're going to need a couple of things. You need there to be hippos, and you also need there to be the property of fatness. or of being fat. But just those two things are not enough by themselves. It seems like, you could have hippos and then you could have other things besides hippos that, are fat, and that wouldn't be enough for it to be true that hippos are fat. What we need is something to tie those things together. We need something that sort of ties together hippos with the property of fatness, so that hippos are actually have that property or instantiate that property. And
Justin, you froze up, so just wait a moment. Hopefully he comes back. Okay, looks like you're back. So,
cool.
I think when you froze up, I stopped you pretty much immediately, so you can pick up the train of thought where you heard me say stop.
Okay. Yeah. So, what was I talking about actually? So Armstrong thinks, like, in order for it to be true that hippos are fat, what you need is hippos and the property of being fat, and then you need them to be tied together somehow. You need there to be hippos having that property, and it's that thing, the having of the property by the hippos, which is the fact, or in Alston or Armstrong's terminology, the state of affairs. And so I take this view in the paper. I say, all right, let's say that facts are these Armstrongian entities. They're instantiations of properties by objects. And that is the second ingredient in my story. And then I guess let's do the third ingredient. So the third ingredient in the story is just that there are true counterfactuals of freedom. There are counterfactuals of freedom that instantiate the property of being true. And this is something that I pretty much just assume in the paper. It's a controversial assumption. There's a lot of debate about this, in the literature on Molinism. But the objection that I'm trying to deal with in the paper grants this assumption. And so dialectically, I think it's appropriate to use it. But I also say something in the paper about what exactly a counterfactual of freedom is on the Molinist view, because the Molinist theory kind of carves out a theoretical role for counterfactuals of freedom to fill. It gives them a certain role to play, and that tells you a little bit about what sort of a thing they are. And some of the things that seem to be true about counterfactuals of freedom on the Molinist view are that, well, they instantiate the property of being true, or at least some of them do. So they're the sort of thing that can have that property. And also, they're the sort of thing that are around even before God creates anything on the Molinist view. And so that narrows down like the candidates for like what sort of a thing could a counterfactual of freedom be. One plausible candidate that could fill this role would be an abstract proposition. So a proposition construed as an abstract entity that represents, the world as being a certain way. Another alternative that I think fits well with this view is to say that maybe they're divine thoughts. So there are a lot of theists who think that the things that philosophers call propositions are actually just God's thoughts. And that's another option that I think will work for the Molinist here. Okay, but so those are the three ingredients. And then all you have to do is just sort of put them together, and an account of how God knows counterfactuals of freedom kind of just falls right out. So an account of how middle knowledge works just falls right out of these three ingredients. So it goes like this. So that last ingredient was there are these things, counterfactuals of freedom, which are perhaps abstract objects or something like that, that instantiate the property of being true. If that's the case, then given the second ingredient, which is that account of facts, it follows that any case of a counterfactual of freedom instantiating the property of being true is a fact in this David Armstrong sense. And if that's the case, then by that first ingredient, which is Alston's theory of God's mode of knowledge, it follows that God is directly acquainted with each case of a counterfactual of freedom instantiating the property of being true. Because each of those is a fact, and on Alston's view, God is directly acquainted with every fact. And so what you get is this picture of God being directly acquainted with every case of a counterfactual of freedom instantiating the property of being true. And it seems to me that just like you might think that my direct acquaintance with my own thoughts is sufficient for me to have knowledge of those thoughts, you might think similarly that God's direct acquaintance with a counterfactual instantiating the property of being true is sufficient for God to know that that counterfactual is true. So that's the proposal.
Very good. So at this point, we've laid out what Molinism is. It had those two components. We raised a problem in the form of a question just to kind of get us thinking, which was, how can God know that these counterfactuals are true prior to the creation of the world? I hope I asked that question fairly.
That sounded good to me.
Okay, and then your response to the question, the way you answer the question, is say, well, it's easy to cook up some middle knowledge. I just need 3 ingredients. 1, God's directly acquainted with every fact. 2, facts are instantiations of properties by objects. And 3, some counterfactuals of freedom instantiate the property of being true. And then you say, voila, here's a nice bowl of middle knowledge. Now,
Yeah.
I'll give a quote from the paper that I thought that summed it up even better than my little analogy there. So you said, just as my direct acquaintance with facts about what is going on in my own mind is sufficient for my knowing those facts, so God's direct acquaintance with the fact that a counterfactual of freedom is true is sufficient for God to know that the counterfactual of freedom is true. And I think that pretty well sums up your answer. Is that fair?
Yep. I think that's fair. I also really like how you extend cooking analogy.
So now you, at the very end of your paper, you say, how might an anti-Molinist respond? So what are some potential objections to your proposed solution?
Right, yeah. So there's one main objection that I talk about in the paper, and it goes like this. So there's this traditional dogma that says that abstract objects cannot be causally connected to anything. They don't cause anything, and they're not causally affected by anything. And so you might think, well, look, in order for God to be acquainted with some propositions instantiating the property of being true, that's going to require some sort of causal connection between God and the proposition, and that would violate the traditional dogma. And so God is not acquainted with propositions instantiating the property of being true. That's the objection that I think about a bit in the paper. I actually think that there are a lot of ways that one can respond to this objection, but there's one response that I spend the most time on, and so let me just briefly summarize that one. I think that it is false that in order for God to be acquainted with like a counterfactual instantiating the property of truth, then God must be like causally connected to that counterfactual. And I think one way to see that that's false is to think about the acquaintance relation. It seems to me that that relation is not a causal relation, and it also doesn't depend on one. So return to like the analogy of like just an ordinary person contemplating their own thoughts. It seems like you could have, suppose God creates a person, but a person who exists only instantaneously, so only at one instant of time. I think God could create that person such that at the one instant at which they exist, they are having a certain thought and they stand in an acquaintance relation at that instant with that thought. But if the person only exists for an instant, then provided that we're excluding like simultaneous causation, or we're just at least, even if it's possible, if we don't think simultaneous causation is normally involved in us being acquainted with our thoughts, there really isn't any time for any causal interaction to occur in that case between the person and their thought. And so that's maybe one way of sort of casting doubt on the idea that there need be any causation involved in this sort of acquaintance relationship. Now, you might think, well, isn't it the case that a person is acquainted with their own thoughts because those thoughts are like occurrent in their minds or are occurring to them or something like that? And if that's the case, isn't that because, like, indicating some kind of a causal explanation or something like that? But I think actually it is not. I think it's true that there's an explanation going on there, right? I think it's true that a person is acquainted with their own thoughts because those thoughts occur in their minds or something to that effect. But I think that the because is actually probably tracking something like a grounding relation rather than a causal relation. And here's one reason to think that. Normally, we think that causal connections are contingent, so that if you could tamper with the laws of nature, you could make it the case that anything caused anything is the way that it's sometimes been put. At any rate, you could make it the case that things which normally cause certain effects don't anymore. But it seems to me like you can't sever the connection between like a thought occurring to a mind and a mind being acquainted with that thought. No matter how you tampered with the laws of nature, it would be the case that if a thought occurs to a mind, then the mind is acquainted with that thought. At least, provided that the thought is occurrent and so forth. And so a grounding explanation would actually fit that story better, because we do normally think that grounding explanations work like that. That what grounds what is a necessary matter rather than a contingent matter. Whereas it's contingent, at least normally, in the case of causation. So that's a kind of a quick summary of how I reply to the main objection that I think about in that paper.
Okay. So, and I'm sure there'll be more questions that build on that or that are in this ballpark that are going to come up. So I'm not going to make you expand much more for now. Okay. I think I only have one more question for you. And maybe you already touched on it, so if so, you can tell me. But how does this mechanism of middle knowledge show certain anti-Molinist arguments in the literature to be unsuccessful?
Yeah, good. This is the part that Andrew was asking about, so hopefully I can satisfy him now. Yeah, all right. So now that we've got this account of how it might be that God has middle knowledge, or how it might be that middle knowledge works, I can use this to show that certain arguments against Molinism in the literature are not successful. So the people who have taken this sort of worry that, like, well, it's hard to see how God could possibly know these things, generally they try to take that and turn it into an argument, and when they do, the arguments usually fit a certain schema. And the schema is something like this: identify some condition which God would allegedly have to satisfy in order for God to have middle knowledge, and then claim that God doesn't satisfy that condition, and so infer that God doesn't have middle knowledge. So here's one example. Tim O'Connor says, God knows contingent truths by being directly acquainted with the facts which ground those contingent truths. But O'Connor says, and he's in good company on this, he says there is nothing which grounds counterfactuals of freedom. And so God can't know those contingent truths. God can't know counterfactuals of freedom. All right, so that's O'Connor's argument in a nutshell. But once we've got my account laid out on the table, I think we can see where this argument goes wrong, because it seems to me that it's not the case that in order for God to know a contingent truth, God has to be acquainted with the grounds of that truth. There's another way for God to know a contingent truth, and that is for God to be acquainted with the truth itself, or in other words, the propositions instantiating the property of being true. And so contra O'Connor, I think that we can say, that God has middle knowledge not by being acquainted with the grounds of counterfactuals of freedom, but by being acquainted with the counterfactuals themselves. Okay. Another way that people have tried to run this sort of argument is by requiring a causal connection. So Richard Swinburne and Catherine Rogers independently argue against Molinism in something like the following way. They say, In order for God to know that a counterfactual of freedom is true, there would have to be some sort of a suitable causal connection between God, or perhaps God's mental states on the one hand, and the things that the counterfactual is about on the other hand, like the agent that it's about, or the action that it's about, or something like this. But then they point out that especially before creating the world, those agents and actions just don't exist, and so they can't be causally connected to anything at that point. And some of them never end up existing. And so they conclude that therefore, God does not have middle knowledge. However, once we've got my account on the table, I think it becomes clear that there's another option for a way in which God can know counterfactuals of freedom. God doesn't have to be causally connected to the things that counterfactuals are about. Instead, on my model, God is connected in a certain way to the counterfactuals themselves. Moreover, that connection is not a causal one, as I argued a minute ago, or at least tried to argue. And so the causal requirement that Rogers and Swinburne demand in their argument is, I think, not actually a requirement on middle knowledge. So I think that their arguments fail as well. And then here I'll give one more example. So Hugh McCann has a version of this argument where he says that in order for God to have middle knowledge, it would have to be the case that before creating, there was adequate evidence of which counterfactuals of freedom are true. Evidence that was good enough to give God infallible knowledge of those counterfactuals of freedom. So it could not possibly be misleading evidence. And then McCann argues that there is no such evidence before creating the world. And one kind of way of getting at what he's talking about here is like, well, think about, before creating the world, all we've got is God and like a range of possible ways that things could be, or that God could create or something. And so there's like no indication of like, well, how would this person choose if they were in these circumstances? Okay, so that's McCann's argument. And again, once we've got my account on the table, I think we can see that McCann's argument fails. Now, in this case, there's a couple of different directions you could go. You might think that my account is an account of like what evidence God does have before creating the world of which counterfactuals are true. If you think that by being directly acquainted with a fact, you thereby have, really good evidence for that fact. And that's one direction you could go. Alternatively, you might think that my model shows that you can know a fact without having evidence for it, if you think that's what's going on in the case when somebody is directly acquainted with a fact. Either way, though, one of the steps in McCann's argument is going to turn out to be false. So that's how I reply to some of the arguments in the literature using that model that I've tried to develop.
Okay, very good. So we've talked for about 45 minutes. I want you to attempt to summarize this whole discussion as concisely as you can. Go.
Yep. Okay. So the whole discussion is about Molinism, which is just a certain theory about how God controls the world. And it relies on this notion called middle knowledge, which is just a special type of knowledge that God is supposed to have, according to the Molinist, about what various people would do in various circumstances. And there's a worry for this view. Well, there's many worries, but one of them, and the one we've been talking about, is, well, how could God possibly know that, right? Even if there are facts like that, how could God know them in the way that the Molinist thinks God does? And what I've tried to do is offer an answer to that question by sort of sketching a model of how God can know them. And then we saw how once that model is on the table, certain arguments against Molinism that are sort of based on that question, or start with a question like that, turn out to fail.
Very good. Okay, so here's what we are going to do now. You, the viewer, can type your question in the chat. I know the programmer, that's a YouTube person, he asked at the beginning, can we ask questions? Yes. So go ahead and type your questions in the chat now. And while you're doing that, listen to this important announcement. Please consider supporting me on Patreon. And the reason is if you really value the work that I'm doing on YouTube, if you think that it's making an impact and you want to see it make a bigger impact, if it's benefited you personally, then please consider becoming one of my supporters. And you can do that by going to www.patreon.com/ccapologetics. It won't just help my ministry. It would help my family, my wife, and my son incredibly. So please consider doing that. And if you can't support me on Patreon, I understand. You can help just by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. All right, let's jump into the questions. So we have the entire interview. The chat was very active, and it was largely Liz and Andrew talking. So, and they're offering a lot of critiques as you go. So, let me pull the first question I see. So the very first question I see comes from Liz, and actually no, it comes from BDS. I'll put both questions up because they're kind of related. So BDS, I don't know if I can put two on the screen at the same time. Maybe I can. No, I can't. So it's related to the grounding objection. So BDS said, is this idea similar to William Lane Craig's when he says that there doesn't need to be a truth maker for counterfactuals? The truth maker is simply that they are true. And Liz Jackson said, does your answer to this problem solve the grounding objection too, or is this just a separate objection? So you can answer both of those at the same time.
So maybe I should first say something about what the grounding objection is.
Yeah, that would make most sense.
Yeah. So there is one of the standard objections to Molinism goes like this. In order for counterfactuals of freedom to be true prior to creation, there has to be something which grounds their truth prior to creation. And actually, when people talk about this objection, they usually talk more specifically about truth makers, not just grounds. But the idea is there's got to be something in the world that makes it true, that if I were in certain circumstances, I would choose such and such or whatever. And then the worry is, but there is nothing in the world which seems to be an adequate truth maker for those counterfactuals. And so they can't be true. And so Molinism must be false. All right, so that's roughly the grounding objection. That is to answer the question that was asked. That is not the objection that I'm dealing with in this paper, and my story in this paper doesn't really help with that objection either. In fact, the story I've given in this paper just sort of assumes that there are true counterfactuals of freedom. So the distinction here is between can counterfactuals of freedom be true prior to creation, and can God know them infallibly even if they are true prior to creation? And so there's an objection to both of those claims, right? There's an objection to, whether they can even be true, and that's the grounding objection, and I'm not trying to solve that problem. And then there's an objection to, well, how could God know them even if they are true? That's the problem I'm trying to solve.
Yeah, and that's the way I was, based on reading your paper. It seems like two things going on here. The first is, how can a counterfactual of freedom be true before there's anything to which it corresponds? If that makes sense. Maybe I'm missing the point there, but that's the way I'm thinking of it, is how can these things even be true? That's one question. And then the second question is, how can God assume they're true? Assume that they are true. How can God know their truth value? Yeah.
That's right.
So the grounding objection has more to do with this first, how can they even be true? And the second one is more what you're answering. So while we're on that topic, who might you suggest I interview to answer that grounding objection?
Oh, Well, I think that the person who's done the best work on that is Trenton Merrick's, who is a very influential metaphysician. And a lot of his work that's relevant to this is in a book called Truth and Ontology, though he's also has a couple of papers on Molinism that are relevant as well. So maybe Trenton Merrick's.
All right. I heard he's high profile from a good source named Andrew Moon.
Yes,
And
yes,
so
big deal.
it might require a lot to get him on. I don't know. Okay, but I will attempt it. Okay, so super cool announcement. Aaron Davis gave me a super chat of $5. He's been watching my videos for a while. I really appreciate that. So I'm going to ask his question next. He asked, does this definition of facts pose problems to divine simplicity? So he said, for example, would it require God to instantiate non-Cambridge properties?
Hmm.
What do you
Um,
think?
yeah, so I'm inclined to say it's not obvious to me that this poses a problem like that, and that's because even if there are facts about God that consist in God like instantiating certain properties, you could take the view that God is what's called a thin particular, meaning that God is not made up of God and God's properties, but rather God is just God, and the properties are separate things. And you might even say that the properties depend, God's properties depend on God for their existence. So there's also no threat to something that fans of divine simplicity worry about a bit, which is like whether God is actually like a fundamental object rather than something that depends on God's parts or something like that. So actually, it's not, at least not obvious to me that there would be a problem here for divine simplicity, though I think there's probably a lot to unpack here. So that's just an initial reaction.
All right. So the next question is, oh, by the way, Liz said Trenton Merrick's would be awesome. And
Cool.
actually, there were lots of Taylor Sear is on here, and he was like, "Great question, Aaron." And Andrew was like, "Awesome question." So everyone thought that was a very perceptive question. Good job, Aaron. So let's see. Another question comes from, I want to scroll up. I remember seeing it from Fred H. And if it'll appear on the screen, there we go. He asks, or she, I assume it's he, says, what properties, if any, do the essences of people have prior to God's middle knowledge? In other words, before God actualizes anything, what does each person have at their base level?
Uh-huh. Interesting. Okay, so there are a bunch of options here, one could say, and I don't really have much of a view on this myself. But like, so one thing you could say is you might think that a person's essence is a quality, that it consists of like a unique qualitative property or a unique combination of qualitative properties. And this is a view that you might go for if you hold to this controversial principle. It's called the identity of indiscernibles. So there's a principle called the indiscernibility of identicals that's not very controversial, that almost all philosophers are perfectly happy with. And then there's its more controversial cousin, which is the identity of indiscernibles, which claims that if two things have all of their like qualitative properties in common, then they're actually not two things, they're the same thing. And if you hold that view, then you can say that people have qualitative essences, and it's just whatever unique combination of qualities that only that person has. Wait, there's a kind of a clever variation on that view that was published in Faith and Philosophy, I think back in 2018, but now I'm not gonna. What was author. And it has something to do with like collective essences, which I thought was really clever. But unfortunately I don't remember any of the details. So maybe afterwards I can look it up. We can add a link to it in the description or something. Anyway, so there's another view out there that's been published. Another way you could go is so some people think that there are these properties called hexieties, which are supposed to be non-qualitative properties that are unique to particular objects. And so there's just like this property of being me or something like that, which is this hexiety, and that property is the property that God is, deciding, do I want to instantiate that property or not, when God is, thinking about who to create. And so you might think that a person's essence is a hexiety, or perhaps a hexiety plus certain qualities. You could do that too. And then I think another option here might just be to say, like, look, maybe there are just these brute facts. There's no essences at all. There's just like a brute fact about, like, okay, there is a possible person, Justin, and then there are facts about like what I would do if I were created or something like that. But there's no like essence that corresponds to those facts and which those facts are about. That might be one way that you could go.
Okay. Andrew Moon had a couple of good questions, so I'm going to put those up. He said, or asked, with your answer on the table, it seems to him, he says, haven't we just traded asking how does God know the counterfactuals of freedom with how is God acquainted with the counterfactuals of freedom? So he thinks you've almost just, what's that phrase, pushed the bubble under the carpet, or whatever, the bump under the rug, just you pushed it somewhere else. We went from how does God know the counterfactuals of freedom to, well, how's he acquainted with the counterfactuals of freedom?
Yeah, okay. I think I have two thoughts about this, and it is a good question, so thanks for the question. Well, they've all been good questions so far, so thank you, everyone. So I have two main thoughts about this. First of all, I think that the account makes some progress, because it does tell you a little bit more than just, well, God just knows them, which is, Ken Perzik in a paper says something like, that's what Molinists usually say. And this says a little bit more than that. I give an analogy that I think is informative. I specify a specific kind of relation that's not knowing relation, it's acquaintance relation. This relation is absolutely direct. It's not mediated in any way. So I think I've said a little bit more. On the other hand, I feel there's something fair to the thought that, like, well, but I haven't said a whole lot more. It seems like we're still kind of, in the dark. However, the little bit more that I have said, I think, is enough to show that those objections that I was talking about at the end, kind of one of our last questions, fail. And so I've said enough, I think, to block a handful of related objections to Molinism. And that, I think, is important to progress, even if it hasn't like given us a lot of further enlightenment about like the nature of God or something like that.
Very good. Okay. So a few more questions, and then we're going to wrap up. I know we're hitting about the hour mark right now, but the questions are so good, I'm going to keep going. So Andrew asked, can't God know the counterfactuals of freedom by believing them in a modally secure way? He would believe them if and only if they were true. What about truth tracking / reliabilist theories?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think, so I've never really been satisfied with that suggestion. So let me try to articulate why I find that unsatisfying, but I find my proposal satisfying. I think maybe it has something to do with the fact that my proposal is at least kind of based in an actual case of knowledge that we're familiar with, right? Insofar as it's analogous to how agents are acquainted with their own thoughts. I feel like I have like some independent reason to think that there is a way of knowing that works like this, that works by means of an acquaintance relation. But in the case of where you just say, oh, well, maybe it's just a modally stable relationship. Well, I mean, it is, of course. But I feel like there, we haven't said anything explanatory, right? I want to know, like, well, why? Why do God's beliefs track the facts in this modally stable way? And an acquaintance relationship is one way, I think, of answering that question, right? Because I think that that's an answer to, like, well, why do beliefs about my own thoughts track those thoughts? I think one way of answering that question, one explanation that you can give is directly with those thoughts. So I guess I think that in the case of God's something, my reaction is sort of similar to that. I'm thinking, well, I'm doing a little bit more than just saying, yeah, as a matter of fact, God's beliefs go where the facts go, they track the facts. I'm giving it at least something about, like, well, why, right? In virtue of what do God's beliefs track the facts?
All right, so Liz Jackson asked a good question. She said, or asked, I always say said. She asked, suppose I think propositions are divine thoughts. Would this problem of how God knows counterfactuals of freedom even arise?
Mm-hmm. So I think it might. It's not as obvious that it's a problem, because we think, well, actually, I shouldn't say this, but you might think that God is, like, causally related to God's thoughts. That's actually not obvious, but it's at least not an implausible idea. And if you think that God is causally related to God's own thoughts, then you might think it's there's not even a prima facie problem about how God could know facts about God's thoughts. However, you might think, at least initially, if you don't immediately, like an acquaintance model, you might think that, well, it's not clear how God could know that God's thoughts are true, just because God is, causally related to God's own thoughts or directly acquainted with God's thoughts. Because that's, like, at least prima facie an extrinsic feature of them, for one thing. And so I think it's helpful to bring in this idea of direct acquaintance with every fact, so that it's clear that, oh yeah, God could actually be acquainted with one of God's thoughts instantiating the property of being true. Okay, so that's a sort of a off-the-cuff thought about that. I don't know if Liz will be satisfied, but oh well.
She said, oh yes, good point. Okay, so
cool.
I have two more things to say, and then we're going to wrap up. So Fred H. gave a $5 super chat as well. Thank you so much, Fred H. And I mean, it just, I'm blown away by how people are willing to support me and that they value the work I'm doing. I'm so grateful. Thank you. So the next question is, and this will be the, Liz, I'm not going to ask yours. She asked, isn't it controversial that truth tracking is sufficient for knowledge? I'm not going to ask that question, Liz. So you're not allowed to answer that, Justin.
Okay.
You guys can duke it out on Facebook. I have one final question just because I want to wrap up here. And that is from Matt Thomason. He submitted this in advance. So he asked, it is often objected that prayer is pointless in light of God's foreknowledge. Does Molinism contribute any helpful insights into the meaning and nature of prayer in general, as well as petitionary prayer in particular?
Yeah, okay. So just taking petitionary prayer in general, Molinism has actually been applied to a number of different issues involving prayer. So the main sort of academic book on Molinism is this book by Thomas Flint called Divine Providence, a Molinist account. And he has 2 chapters in that book on prayer. One of them is giving a Molinist account of how God could answer prayers for the past, which I think is just really cool. Whether or not it's true, it's just really fun to think about. Another chapter in that book is an account applying Molinism to the issue of unanswered prayer, or why prayers sometimes go unanswered. And then I think that Molinism can also. William Lane Craig also has actually developed somewhere a Molinist account of how God can answer prayers without miraculously intervening in the world each time God wants to answer a prayer, even if the world is deterministic or something like that. Although it wouldn't be on Molinism, I suppose. So I think Craig has got this neat model of sort of answering prayers using middle knowledge by anticipating what people are going to pray for and setting up the world in a certain way ahead of time. I think that also Molinism is useful for understanding how God could answer prayers that seem to depend on free choices that people make. So, for example, we pray about things like, how our interpersonal relationships are going and what's going to happen in them. We pray about, whether I'll get this job, I'll be offered a job. We pray about, how elections are going to turn out. And all of these are things where it seems like whether the prayer is answered is going to depend on various free choices that people make. And I think Molinism just sort of automatically generates an account of how God could answer prayers like that. So I think Molinism is actually very useful for thinking about prayer and how that works. Now, the questioner asks something specifically about prayer being pointless, and even more specifically about this having something to do with foreknowledge. So there's a ton of work on whether prayer is pointless, but most of that work is about God's moral perfection and whether that renders prayer pointless, because the worry is usually well, isn't God just always going to do whatever's best regardless of what we ask God to do? Tom Flint actually ends up talking about that problem and applying Molinism to it in that chapter of his book on unanswered prayer. But the issue about foreknowledge, I'm not exactly sure what the questioner is getting at here, unless it's maybe something like this. Maybe the questioner is thinking well, if God already knows or foreknows, what people want, what people need, then what's the point of asking, right? We don't need to tell God what we want and ask for it because God already knows ahead of time or something like that. Maybe that's what the questioner has in mind. If it is, I'm not sure that anything unique to Molinism is especially helpful here. But I also don't think that that's a particularly troubling problem. And other people have dealt with this before. But one way of thinking about it is some people say that God instituted the practice of petitionary prayer in order to sort of facilitate a relationship between God and humans. And if you think that's right, then it kind of makes sense that God would often wait for someone to ask for something before giving it to them, even if God already knows that they're going to need it or want it or something like that. Okay, so those are some thoughts about that question.
All right. Well, I want to end the interview there. I've really appreciated you spending some extra time answering these questions. Thank you, Justin.
Sure, it was fun. Thanks.
I had a blast. And for the viewer, if you're a couple of reminders based on what Justin just said. So on the topic of God's foreknowledge, middle knowledge, and petitionary prayer, if you're interested in how those things relate to one another, then on Friday, there's going to be a video released where I do a very short interview. It lasts about 10 minutes, 11 minutes, something like that, with Scott Davison, Dr. Scott Davison at Morehead State University, and he answers that question. So check that video out. And then I actually have several videos on the topic of Molinism. My most recent one was with Dr. Kenny Boyce, who teaches at the University of Missouri, I believe. And it was on how Molinism can actually help solve the problem of animal suffering. And it relates free will and natural evil. So it was a really fascinating interview. Check it out. And I will leave it there. So thank you for watching. Thank you again, Justin. Really enjoyed it. And we will see you all next time.
Thanks.